Professor Quillex adjusted his 3 pairs of spectacles and surveyed his xenobiology classroom with the satisfaction of a being who had spent 200 years perfecting the art of making students uncomfortable. The Zentorian's purple skin gleamed under the artificial suns, and his tentacle fingers drummed impatiently against his lectern as he waited for his most troublesome student to inevitably say something ridiculous. And there he was, Jake Morrison, or Tank, as he insisted everyone call him, slouched in the back row like gravity had personally offended him. The human wore a faded t-shirt that read, "I survived the drop bear migration of 2387, and had the audacity to look bored during a lecture about creatures that could dissolve your internal organs with a casual glance. Today, class, we shall examine the plasma slugs of Kepler 442b, Professor Quillex announced, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone reading a tax code. These magnificent creatures produce a neurotoxin so potent that a single drop can paralyze a full-grown gorillian for 17 standard hours. The class collectively shuddered. Zix, a nervous 4-armed Plutonian sitting in the front row, actually whimpered and began stress-molting. Gornak, a massive stone-like being from the asteroid belt, shifted uncomfortably in his reinforced chair. Even Vila, whose species had evolved on a planet where the rain was mildly acidic, looked genuinely concerned. A hand shot up in the back. "Oh, for the love of the cosmic void," Professor Quillex muttered under his breath, then louder. "Yes, Morrison?" "Professor, do they taste like chicken? Because everything seems to taste like chicken, and I'm getting kind of tired of chicken-flavored things. Also, what's the best way to prepare them? Are we talking grilled, fried, or more of a soup situation?" The classroom fell silent except for the gentle humming of the life support systems in what sounded suspiciously like Pip, a small crystalline being having some kind of panic attack. Professor Quillex's eye stalks twitched. "Morrison, these are not food items. They are lethal xenobiological specimens that have been known to kill entire research teams." "Right, but that doesn't answer my question about seasoning," Jake replied, leaning forward with genuine interest. "I mean, back home in Queensland we had these spiders that could drop a full-grown man in 12 minutes, and they made excellent stir-fry. Had to catch them just right, though. Timing was everything." Zix made a noise that sounded like air escaping from a punctured tire. "You ate your planet's apex predators?" "Well, not apex exactly. That honor goes to the drop bears, and nobody's figured out how to cook those yet. Too gamey. But the spiders, scorpions, snakes, box jellyfish, those were all fair game. Mum always said if it's trying to kill you, it probably has decent protein content." Professor Quillex felt a headache forming between his primary and secondary brain stems. In all his years of teaching, he had never encountered a species so fundamentally wrong about the basic concept of survival. Most sentient beings understood that when something could kill you, the appropriate response was fear, respect, and a healthy distance. Humans, apparently, saw a dinner invitation. "Morrison," the professor said slowly, "do you understand that we are discussing creatures that have evolved specifically to end life as efficiently as possible?" Jake shrugged. "Yeah, evolution's wild like that. Really brings out the flavor, though. Natural selection's basically just seasoning with extra steps." The rest of the class stared at the human with a mixture of horror and fascination, like watching someone juggle activated plasma grenades while riding a unicycle. It was terrifying, impossible to look away from, and somehow Jake made it look effortless. Professor Quillex realized, with growing dread, that this semester was going to require significantly more alcohol than usual. Professor Quillex had reached what humans might call his breaking point, though Zentorians preferred the term pedagogical limit exceeded. He watched Jake Morrison casually sketch what appeared to be cooking instructions in his notebook, while the rest of the class huddled together like prey animals, sensing an approaching storm. "Very well, Morrison," the professor said, his voice taking on the dangerous calm of someone about to make a terrible decision. "Since you seem to think our galaxy's most lethal creatures are merely undiscovered cuisine, perhaps a more hands-on approach to learning is required." Zix's 4 arms immediately began making rapid gestures that roughly translated to "please no, please no, please no" in Plutonian sign language. The poor creature had been assigned as Jake's study partner at the beginning of the semester, a decision that Professor Quillex was beginning to suspect had shortened Zix's lifespan by several decades. "Now we're talking," Jake said, perking up like a dog hearing the dinner bell. "Are we doing a practical exam? Because I brought my own seasonings." He reached into his backpack and pulled out what appeared to be a small arsenal of spice containers. "Got some ghost pepper powder here, bit of garlic salt, and this stuff I picked up on Rigel 7 that the locals call tongue fire." Professor Quillex activated his desk's security protocols and watched as a series of containment fields shimmered to life. Let us begin with something simple. Behold, the crimson stalkers of Vega Prime. A cylindrical container rose from the floor, filled with what looked like angry red centipedes the size of house cats. They moved with predatory grace, their multiple legs creating an unsettling, clicking symphony against the transparent walls. Their mandibles dripped with a substance that was actively corroding the container's inner coating. The class collectively scooted their chairs backward. Gornek actually stood up and moved to the far wall, which was impressive considering he weighed approximately 3 tons. Jake leaned forward, studying the creatures with the focused attention of a chef examining prime cuts. Ooh, those are nice. Good color, decent size. What's their toxicity rating? Class 7, Professor Quillex replied. Their venom can dissolve bone marrow in under 30 seconds. Excellent tenderizing properties then, Jake nodded approvingly. Are they bottom feeders, or do they go after live prey? Diet affects the meat quality, you know. Vela made a sound like wind chimes having an anxiety attack. Jake, they literally eat their prey from the inside out while it's still alive. So, free range then. Even better, Jake made another note. What about preparation time? Do I need to remove the venom sacs, or does cooking neutralize the toxins? Professor Quillex felt his sanity slipping away like sand through an hourglass. This was not going according to plan. He activated another containment unit. Perhaps these will command more respect, the shadow devourers of the Andromeda sector. The new container held what appeared to be living darkness with far too many teeth. The creatures moved like liquid nightmares, occasionally revealing glimpses of bioluminescent organs that pulsed with malevolent energy. Even Jake seemed momentarily impressed. Okay, that's definitely more challenging, he admitted. Are they actually shadow-based life forms, or is that just marketing? Because cooking incorporeal beings is tricky. Not impossible, mind you, but you need specialized equipment. Zix buried his head in all 4 hands. Jake, please stop talking. Every word you say makes Professor Quillex more determined to prove humans are insane. We're not insane, Jake protested. We're just practical. You see a deadly predator, I see untapped culinary potential. It's all about perspective. Pip, the small crystalline being, finally found his voice. But they're called shadow devourers. The name literally tells you they devour things. How is that appetizing? Jake grinned. Mate, you should see what we named our food back on Earth. We've got dishes called Toad in the Hole, Spotted Dick, and Death by Chocolate. Names don't mean anything. It's all about the execution. Professor Quillex realized he was witnessing either the bravest or most suicidal student he'd ever encountered. Possibly both. The truly terrifying part was that Jake seemed completely sincere about everything he was saying. This is madness, the professor muttered, but there was a grudging fascination creeping into his voice. How had an entire species survived long enough to develop space travel with this attitude toward mortal danger? Jake raised his hand again. Professor, hypothetically speaking, what's the biggest, scariest thing you've got in storage? Because I'm thinking maybe we start with the really impressive stuff and work our way down. Go big or go home, you know? The class stared at their human classmate with a mixture of terror and awe. Even Professor Quillex found himself curious about just how far this insanity would go. Against his better judgment, he began accessing his secure specimen vault. Rommel's tentacle fingers trembled as they hovered over his desk's secure access panel. Somewhere deep in his Zentorian brain, the part responsible for self-preservation was screaming at him to stop, to simply give the human a passing grade and pretend this conversation never happened. But the larger part, the part that had dedicated his life to xenobiology and had seen his authority challenged by a species that apparently seasoned their breakfast cereal, demanded satisfaction. Morrison, he said slowly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, you want to see something impressive? The entire classroom held its breath. Even the air recycling system seemed to quiet down, as if the ship itself was leaning in to listen. Jake, meanwhile, had pulled out what appeared to be a small notebook labeled Recipes to Try in handwriting that looked suspiciously optimistic. Always up for a good show, Professor, Jake replied, clicking his pen with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly never experienced proper existential dread. Professor Quillex entered his security codes with deliberate ceremony. Each beep from the console seemed to echo through the classroom like a funeral bell. Zix had begun what looked like prayer gestures with all 4 arms, while Gornek had actually pressed himself against the far wall so hard that he was leaving indent marks in the metal. What I am about to show you, Professor Quillex announced, represents the apex of evolutionary malevolence, the ultimate expression of nature's capacity for creating death in its purest form. A new containment unit began rising from the floor. This one significantly larger than the previous specimens, and surrounded by so many warning lights and security fields that it looked like a small star going supernova. The hum of power systems throughout the classroom dimmed as energy was diverted to maintain the containment protocols. "Behold," Professor Quillex said with the solemnity of someone unveiling a monument to their own impending doom. "The legendary Void Hornets of the Nexus Nebula." Even Jake stopped writing for a moment as the container fully emerged. Inside, floating in a specially designed zero-gravity chamber, were insects that seemed to violate several laws of physics just by existing. They were roughly the size of Earth hummingbirds, but their bodies appeared to be composed of crystallized darkness, with wings that seemed to cut holes in the very air around them. Their stingers glowed with an internal light that hurt to look at directly, and when they moved, reality seemed to bend slightly around their flight paths. The silence in the classroom was so complete that everyone could hear Pip's crystal matrix vibrating with terror. "These creatures," Professor Quillex continued, his voice gaining confidence as he watched even the unflappable human seem momentarily speechless, "are not merely venomous. They exist partially outside normal space-time. Their stingers can phase through most known materials, making traditional protection useless. Their venom doesn't simply kill, it erases. Victims don't die so much as they stop having ever existed." Vila made a sound like wind chimes being murdered. "Professor, why do we even have those things? Why would anyone capture them?" Dangerously wide-eyed, Professor Quillex said carefully, "During a research expedition that went very, very wrong, the only survivor brought back this single breeding pair before suffering what the medical team described as aggressive reality displacement." Jake had resumed writing, but his pen moved more slowly now, and for the first time since the semester began, there was a thoughtful expression on his face, rather than casual enthusiasm. "Okay," Jake said finally. "I'll admit, that's pretty metal. The whole erasing from existence thing is new. But I've got to ask the obvious question." Professor Quillex felt a familiar sense of impending doom. "Which is, how do they taste?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to the universe itself. Zix actually fainted, his forearms going limp as he slumped forward onto his desk. Gornek began making what sounded like rock-based prayer sounds. Even the Void Hornets seemed to pause in their otherworldly buzzing, as if they too were processing the sheer audacity of the question. Professor Quillex stared at the human for a long moment, his 3 pairs of eyes blinking in sequence as his brain attempted to process what he had just heard. Then something snapped. Not broke exactly, but shifted fundamentally, like a gear clicking into place after years of grinding uselessly. "Morrison," he said quietly, "are you seriously asking me about the flavor profile of creatures that can erase you from the timeline?" "Well, yeah," Jake replied, as if this was the most reasonable question in the galaxy. "I mean, they're clearly apex predators from a high-energy environment. That usually means excellent muscle density and complex flavor compounds. Plus, anything that can mess with space-time probably has some interesting metabolic processes going on. Could be delicious." Professor Quillex felt something that might have been madness, or enlightenment, or possibly both. "You know what, Morrison? Let's find out." The classroom erupted in various species-specific expressions of horror. Gornek actually tried to leave, but the classroom security protocols had automatically engaged when the Void Hornets were released, sealing everyone inside. "Here's what we're going to do," Professor Quillex announced, his voice taking on the manic energy of someone who had completely abandoned rational thought. "A practical examination. You think you can handle any creature in the galaxy? Prove it. I'm going to release one of these Void Hornets. If you can capture it safely without being erased from existence, you pass my class with full marks. If you can't, well, the university will have a very interesting insurance claim to file." Jake's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Now you're talking my language, Professor. This is going to be fun." Pip managed to squeak out a question. "What if Jake gets erased? Will we remember that he existed?" Professor Quillex paused, his finger hovering over the containment release. "That's an excellent question. I honestly have no idea." Jake stood up and began rolling up his sleeves. "Only one way to find out, I guess. Professor, you might want to have the cafeteria prep a victory feast. I've got a feeling we're about to expand the campus meal plan in some very interesting directions." The containment field flickered as Professor Quillex initiated the release sequence. Somewhere in the distance, alarms began to sound. "This is either going to be the greatest teaching moment of my career," Professor Quillex muttered, "or the shortest." Jake cracked his knuckles and grinned. "Professor, trust me. I grew up in Queensland. After drop bears and funnel web spiders, how scary can one little interdimensional hornet really be? The containment field collapsed with a sound like reality hiccuping, and the void hornet emerged into normal space-time with what could only be described as malevolent curiosity. It hovered in the center of the classroom, its crystalline body refracting light in ways that made everyone's eyes water, while its wings created small tears in the air that revealed glimpses of absolutely nothing beyond. The rational response would have been to run, scream, or possibly both, while also praying to whatever deities might have jurisdiction over interdimensional insect encounters. Instead, Jake Morrison pulled a small spray bottle from his backpack and began misting himself with what appeared to be barbecue sauce. "Jake, what are you doing?" Zix whispered, having regained consciousness just in time to witness what was clearly about to become the most spectacular suicide in galactic academic history. "Basic preparation, mate," Jake replied calmly, rolling up his sleeves to reveal arms that looked like they'd been used as practice targets by every venomous creature in the known universe. The scars formed an impressive collection of bite marks, sting patterns, and what appeared to be at least 3 different types of chemical burns. First rule of dealing with aggressive wildlife: make yourself less appetizing than the alternatives. Professor Quelex watched in fascination as the human approached the floating nightmare with the casual confidence of someone approaching a slightly annoying housefly. "Morrison, that creature can phase through solid matter and erase your molecular structure from existence. I don't think barbecue sauce is going to deter it." "You'd be surprised how often condiments solve problems," Jake replied, now within what any reasonable being would consider the instant death radius. The Void Hornet turned toward him, its multifaceted eyes reflecting dimensions that shouldn't exist. "Back home I used to catch funnel web spiders with nothing but a jar and some Vegemite. It's all about understanding predator psychology." The Hornet buzzed closer, its stinger beginning to glow with reality-warping energy. The class collectively held their breath, waiting for Jake to simply cease existing. Instead, he did something that defied every survival instinct in the known galaxy. He held out his hand. "Easy there, beautiful," Jake said, in the tone one might use to calm a nervous horse. "I know you're probably confused. New environment, bright lights, bunch of weird aliens staring at you. That's got to be stressful." The Void Hornet paused, hovering inches from Jake's outstretched palm. Its wings slowed their reality-slicing motion, and the tears in space-time began to seal themselves. "Here's the thing about apex predators," Jake continued, his voice steady and calm. "They don't attack unless they feel threatened or they're hunting. You're not hunting right now, are you?" "No, you're just trying to figure out what's going on." Gornak made a sound like boulders having an argument. "Jake, it's a Void Hornet. It doesn't have feelings. It's pure evolutionary malice given form." "Nah, that's just what people say when they don't understand something," Jake replied, never taking his eyes off the creature. "Every animal's got its reasons, even the nastiest ones. Back in Queensland we had these box jellyfish that could kill you in 3 minutes flat. Turns out they were just really, really nearsighted and got scared easily. Once you knew that, they were practically harmless." The Void Hornet settled gently onto Jake's palm, its stinger retracting to a less reality-threatening length. The classroom fell so silent that the hum of the life support system sounded like a thunderstorm. "See?" Jake said, gently stroking the creature's crystalline carapace with one finger. "Just needed someone to treat you like a living being instead of a doomsday weapon. You're actually kind of beautiful, aren't you? That whole light-bending thing you do is pretty impressive." Professor Quillex felt his worldview undergoing rapid and possibly permanent restructuring. "Morrison, how are you not dead?" "Well, for starters, I'm not radiating fear pheromones like everyone else in here," Jake replied, allowing the Hornet to crawl up his arm. "Animals can smell terror from miles away, and it makes them aggressive. Also, I've been stung by pretty much everything Australia has to offer, so my pain tolerance is probably a bit higher than average." "But the reality displacement," Vila stammered. "The existential erasure." Jake shrugged, causing the Void Hornet to briefly take flight before settling on his shoulder like some kind of interdimensional parrot. "Yeah, about that. I think your research team might have misunderstood what they were seeing. This little guy's not erasing people from existence. He's just really, really good at making them think they don't exist anymore. It's a defense mechanism. Psychological warfare instead of actual warfare." He reached into his backpack and pulled out what appeared to be a small piece of jerky. The Void Hornet immediately perked up, its antennae twitching with interest. "Hungry, are you?" Jake said, offering the snack. "I bet you haven't had a proper meal in ages stuck in that containment unit. No wonder you're cranky." The Hornet delicately accepted the jerky with its mandibles, and as it began to eat, something remarkable happened. Its crystalline body began to shimmer with softer colors, less harsh and reality-bending, more like a living prism catching sunlight. "Jake," Zik said quietly, "I think you just solved a mystery that's been baffling xenobiologists for decades." "Nah," Jake replied, gently scratching behind what might have been the hornet's ears if interdimensional insects had ears. "Just basic animal husbandry. Feed them properly, give them some respect, and most creatures turn out to be pretty reasonable. The ones that don't, well, those usually taste the best anyway." Professor Quillex stared at his student, at the supposedly lethal creature now contentedly grooming itself on the human's shoulder, and realized he was witnessing something that would revolutionize xenobiology forever. Or at least make for one hell of a research paper. "Morrison," he said slowly, "I believe you may have just redefined our understanding of aggressive xenofauna." Jake grinned. "Cool. So do I pass the class?" "With honors," Professor Quillex replied, already mentally composing his resignation letter. After this, regular teaching was going to seem impossibly boring. What happened next would later be described in academic papers as the Morrison incident, though Jake himself preferred to think of it as that time I fixed everyone's homework. The Void Hornet, now apparently named Buzzy according to the human's cheerful introductions, had begun exploring the classroom with the curious enthusiasm of a tourist in a gift shop. "Right then," Jake said, pulling out his phone and starting to record what appeared to be a video call. "Mom?" "Yeah, it's me. No, I'm not dead. Yes, I'm eating properly. Listen, I've got this situation here and I could use some advice." Professor Quillex watched in bewilderment as Jake held up his phone so the camera could capture the Void Hornet, who was now investigating Zik's notebook with what appeared to be genuine interest. "See this little beauty? Found her locked up in what's basically solitary confinement. Poor thing's been stress-eating for who knows how long. What do you think?" A voice emerged from the phone's speaker, tinged with what sounded like fond exasperation and an accent that could strip paint. "Jake Morrison, are you calling your mother to ask about caring for another stray? What is it this time? Please tell me it's not another drop bear." "Interdimensional hornet, actually. Really quite sweet once you get to know her. But look at this living situation." Jake turned the camera to show the sterile containment unit. No enrichment, no proper food, no social interaction. It's no wonder she was lashing out at people. The entire class listened in fascination as Jake's mother, apparently unfazed by interdimensional insects, began dispensing care advice with the efficiency of someone who had clearly been through this routine before. "Proper nutrition first, love. What's she been eating?" "Some kind of synthetic protein paste, from the look of it," Jake replied, examining the containment unit's feeding system. "Probably hasn't had a decent meal in months." "Right, well, you know what to do then. And Jake, make sure she's got proper space to move around. Cramped conditions make any creature aggressive." Professor Quillex found his voice. "Morrison, are you seriously consulting your mother about the care and feeding of one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators?" "Most dangerous neglected animal, more like," Jake corrected, ending the call and pocketing his phone. "Mom raised 6 kids and ran a wildlife sanctuary on the side. If anyone knows about difficult creatures, it's her." Jake began examining the classroom with the critical eye of someone conducting a property inspection. "Right, first things first. This lighting is terrible, too harsh, wrong spectrum entirely. Buzzy here is probably suffering from seasonal affective disorder on top of everything else." He moved to the classroom's environmental controls and began making adjustments with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly been reading the technical manuals in his spare time. The harsh white light softened to a warmer, more natural tone that immediately made the entire room feel more comfortable. The Void Hornet's response was immediate and dramatic. Her crystalline body began to glow with softer, more varied colors, and she started making a sound that could only be described as purring, if interdimensional insects could purr. "Better?" Jake asked, and Buzzy responded by doing a small loop in the air that looked suspiciously like happiness. Zix, who had been watching this entire exchange with growing amazement, raised one of his 4 hands tentatively. "Jake, are you saying that the most feared creature in known space has just been really depressed?" "Among other things, yeah," Jake replied, now examining the containment unit's air circulation system with obvious disapproval. "Look at this setup. No airflow, recycled atmosphere, probably full of stress hormones by now. It's like keeping a person locked in a bathroom for 6 months and then wondering why they're antisocial." He began dismantling parts of the containment system, ignoring Professor Quillex's increasingly frantic protests about safety protocols and insurance liability. Morrison, those containment fields are there for a reason, the professor spluttered. Yeah, and that reason is that nobody bothered to figure out what these creatures actually need, Jake replied, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Back home, we learned pretty quick that most dangerous animals are just scared, hungry, or protecting their territory. Treat the cause instead of the symptoms, and you usually end up with a much happier outcome for everyone involved. Within minutes, Jake had transformed the sterile containment unit into something that looked more like a habitat than a prison. He'd rearranged the space to include multiple levels, improved the air circulation, and even added what appeared to be a small water feature made from repurposed lab equipment. Buzzy immediately began exploring her upgraded accommodations with obvious delight, her colors shifting through what could only be described as a rainbow of contentment. Now for the real test, Jake said, pulling out his collection of spice containers again. Proper nutrition. Buzzy, love, want to try some actual seasoning on your food instead of that synthetic paste? The class watched in stunned silence as Jake prepared what appeared to be a gourmet meal for an interdimensional predator, complete with garnishes and a tiny portion of what looked suspiciously like the jerky he'd been snacking on earlier. Daisy's reaction to the properly prepared food was nothing short of ecstatic. She performed what could only be described as a victory dance in mid-air before settling down to eat with obvious enthusiasm. Jake, Vila said quietly, I think you just revolutionized xenobiology. Nah, Jake replied, watching Buzzy with the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved a particularly interesting puzzle. Just applied some basic common sense. Most problems aren't as complicated as people make them out to be. Professor Quillick sank into his chair, staring at the scene before him. The most dangerous creature in his collection was now happily redecorating her habitat, occasionally pausing to perform what appeared to be grateful aerial acrobatics for her human caretaker. This is going to completely change how we approach dangerous species, he muttered. Jake grinned. Speaking of which, Professor, I've been thinking. The university's got all these amazing creatures locked up in containment units, right? Seems like a waste. What if we started a program where students could actually interact with them properly? You know, learn about their real behavior instead of just reading about how scary they're supposed to be? The professor's eye stalks began twitching again, but this time it might have been excitement rather than impending nervous breakdown. Morrison, are you suggesting we turn the xenobiology department into some kind of interdimensional petting zoo? More like a proper sanctuary and research facility, Jake replied. Think about it. Happy, healthy specimens, better research data, students who actually understand the creatures instead of just fearing them. Plus, I bet half these deadly species would make excellent campus pets once they're properly cared for. Buzzy chose that moment to settle on Jake's shoulder and begin grooming his hair with obvious affection, as if to prove his point. Professor Quillex looked around his classroom, at his students who were now watching the interdimensional hornet with fascination rather than terror, and realized that his teaching methods were about to undergo some very significant changes. Morrison, he said slowly, I believe you may have just given me the most terrifying and brilliant idea of my career. Jake's grin widened. Just wait until you see what I can do with the really big specimens. 3 weeks later, the Galactic Academy's Xenobiology Department had undergone what the administration diplomatically referred to as significant operational restructuring, though everyone else called it the Morrison Revolution. The sterile laboratory had been transformed into something that looked like a cross between a nature preserve and the galaxy's most unusual bed and breakfast. Professor Quillex stood in what used to be his pristine classroom, watching Jake demonstrate proper Void Hornet communication techniques to a group of visiting researchers from the Andromeda Institute. Buzzy, now sporting what appeared to be a tiny friendship bracelet made from recycled lab equipment, was performing aerial maneuvers that spelled out mathematical equations in interdimensional script. The key, Jake was explaining to his captivated audience, is understanding that intelligence doesn't always look like what we expect. Buzzy here has been trying to teach us advanced physics this whole time. We just thought she was being aggressive because we couldn't read the signs. Dr. Fleming, a distinguished Regalian researcher, raised 3 of her tentacles in academic surrender. Morrison, in 6 decades of xenobiological study, I have never seen anything like this. How did you know to try musical communication with a creature that supposedly exists partially outside normal space-time? Jake shrugged, with characteristic modesty. Mom always said music is universal. Plus, Buzzy kept buzzing in patterns that sounded like Bach. Seemed rude not to respond. Across the room, Zix was conducting what appeared to be a peaceful negotiation with a formerly aggressive plasma slug, using a combination of interpretive dance and what looked like finger painting. The slug, now a healthy pink color instead of its previous angry red, was creating what the art department had tentatively classified as abstract expressionist biosculpture. "I still can't believe this is working," Zix muttered, carefully adding what appeared to be glitter to his latest collaborative piece. "6 months ago I was afraid of my own shadow. Now I'm co-authoring research papers with a creature that used to dissolve titanium for fun." Gornek, the massive stone-like being, had discovered an unexpected talent for creature psychology and was currently serving as a counselor for a support group of previously antisocial specimens. The sight of a 3-ton rock formation leading group therapy sessions for interdimensional predators had become surprisingly normal around the department. "Remember," Gornek was saying in his rumbling voice, "aggressive behavior is often just unmet needs expressing themselves destructively. Razortooth, would you like to share what we discussed about healthy boundary setting?" Clearly, a creature that looked like a cross between a shark and a disco ball made what everyone had learned to recognize as thoughtful consideration sounds. Professor Quillix approached Jake, who was currently teaching Vila how to prepare what he called fusion cuisine for their new research partners. "Morrison," the professor said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and what might have been mild trauma. "I need to ask you something that's been troubling me." "Sure, Professor. What's up?" "Is there anything in this galaxy that you wouldn't try to befriend, rehabilitate, or possibly eat?" Jake considered this seriously while stirring what appeared to be a soup made from ingredients that violated several known laws of chemistry. "Well, there is one thing." Professor Quillix felt a familiar sense of impending revelation. "Which is?" "The cafeteria's mystery meat casserole. I mean, I've eaten funnel-web spiders, tried to cook a drop bear once, and now I'm sharing meals with interdimensional insects. But that casserole? That's where I draw the line." The professor looked across his transformed department, where students and formerly dangerous creatures were collaborating on research projects that were rewriting textbooks across the galaxy. The Void Hornets had formed what appeared to be a small orchestra, and were performing complex mathematical theorems in 4-part harmony. The Shadow Devourers had turned out to be accomplished poets, once someone figured out how to provide proper lighting for their bioluminescent verses. "You know, Morrison," Professor Quillix said thoughtfully, "I think I understand now why humans managed to develop space travel despite living on a planet that seems designed to kill them." "Yeah? Why's that?" "Because you're all completely insane, and somehow that makes you better at solving problems than the rest of us." Jake grinned and ladled some of his experimental soup into a bowl, offering it to the professor. "Insanity's just another word for thinking outside the box, Professor. Want to try some interdimensional bisque? I used ingredients from 6 different dimensions. It's either going to be delicious or open a small portal to the void. Either way, it'll be interesting." Professor Quillix accepted the bowl with the resigned courage of someone who had already had his worldview completely restructured and figured he might as well see how far down the rabbit hole went. He took a sip. It was, against all reasonable expectations, absolutely delicious. "Morrison," he said after a moment, "I have one final question." "Shoot." "Would you be interested in teaching a masterclass? I think the galaxy could use more of whatever it is you do." Jake looked around the transformed classroom, at his fellow students collaborating with creatures that textbooks had classified as too dangerous to study, at research happening that would benefit every species in known space, and at Buzzy, who had apparently learned to spell his name in interdimensional light patterns. "You know what, Professor? I think I'd like that, but I've got one condition." "Name it." "We're definitely going to need a bigger kitchen." As if on cue, the interdimensional Hornet Orchestra launched into what sounded suspiciously like a victory fanfare, while, across the room, the plasma slugs began what appeared to be a celebratory light show. Professor Quillix smiled, raised his bowl of impossible soup in a toast, and realized that sometimes the best education comes from the most unexpected teachers. Even if those teachers insist on seasoning everything and asking if it's edible. Especially then,